So I do not follow the intricacies of the NFL football season like some people do, but I have to tell you, I was confused at how the Kansas City Chiefs showed up this season. I mean, after the last few seasons, they seemed like a superpower. They won the Super Bowl in 23, 24. They didn't win it in 25, but they made it to the Super Bowl. And then this year, even with Taylor Swift in the stands, they only won 6 games the entire season. It made me scratch my head, and I said, what happened? What happened to the Chiefs this year? And that's exactly as I felt as I was studying this chapter in the life of Abraham. After the last few chapters, he seemed like a true champion. Remember chapter 13? We saw him act in this magnanimous way as he let Lot take the better land in the Jordan Valley to avoid this massive family conflict. And then when Lot got captured with the others from the Jordan Valley, Abram led a small team of armed men and went and rescued them all. And then last week, we saw Abram have this incredible spiritual experience with God, where God appeared to him in fire, in smoke. And he had this covenant-cutting service with Abram where he made these giant promises and promised Abram as many descendants as there are stars in the universe. And Abram became the example for all time of how we are made right with God by faith. As it says in Genesis 15:6, he believed the Lord and it was credited to him as righteousness. And then we get to chapter 16, and we're like, what happened to Abram? I mean, he really doesn't show up in this chapter. And he really, really acts in shameful ways. This has to be the lowest point in the Abram story. And so we're going to see how Abram and Sarai dig themselves into a big hole and how we can avoid falling into the same kind of situation. So let's look at this. Verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant. His name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. So go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. So this is fascinating. After Abram's incredible experience with God, last chapter where God confirmed his covenant, explained his timeline, and appeared to him visibly in smoke and fire, we arrive at this. And Sarai, she's 75 at this point, and she is completely fed up. She is fed up with waiting for God to give her the first child on this multitude of people. Abram just had this experience. She's like, I see no children. So she comes up with this ungodly scheme. She commands Abram to go and sleep with her servant Hagar and get her pregnant. Now, Hagar was a young Egyptian servant that came into the company of Abram and Sarai when they went to Egypt. Do you remember that fiasco from chapter 12? How during a famine in Canaan, Abram went to Egypt with all of his family because there was more food down there. They get there and Abram's afraid of Pharaoh. So he says that Sarai's just his sister, not his wife. And then Pharaoh grabs Sarai up, takes her into his harem. But then God shows up and God inflicts curses and a plague upon Pharaoh's household. He finds out it's because he's got Sarah in the house. So he says, you go with Abraham and you guys get out of here. But he gave them all of this livestock and male and female servants as they left. And Hagar was part of the gifts that they received from Pharaoh. Now, the proposal that Sarai makes here is completely in line with the customs of the ancient Near East during this time. If a woman couldn't bear children, she could give her servant to her husband as an extra wife, and then the servant's child would be considered the child of the mistress, the first wife. But this is not a faith move. This isn't keeping with God's design for one man and one woman for life, which was laid out in Genesis chapter 2. Anytime people start adding wives in the Old Testament, it's never God's will. It's always people going out and trying to do things on their own. So this is Sarai trying to go outside of the boundaries of God's will, and she's blaming God for putting her in this situation where she has to do this. If God had only come through, I wouldn't have to deal with this on my own. And then Sarai, she gets all flustered. She commands Abram to sleep with Hagar. And guys, what should Abram have done at this point? What should he have done? If you have to think too long about it, you're in trouble, okay? If your wife is ever going through a very dark season where she questions her self-worth, her body image, her value in your eyes, and she says, well, why don't you just go and sleep with your secretary? What do you say? You don't say, doggone it, honey, if that would make you feel better, I'll do it. What did Abram do? Verse 3, Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress Sarai. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. So may the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, she's your servant. She's in your power. Do to her as you please. So then Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar, and Hagar fled from her. There is this series of documentaries on Netflix called Trainwreck. And they look at these events that just go disastrously wrong, and they do an autopsy on the event, how bad it got, and the series of decisions that led to the calamity. And they really ought to do a documentary on Genesis 16, Trainwreck, Abraham. The first thing that goes wrong here is that Abram agrees to Sarai's command. Now, commentators point out that the language in verse 3 here ties this back to the fall in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3, where it says that Adam listened to the voice of Eve and ate the forbidden fruit. Here it says Abram listened to the voice of Sarai, meaning he chose to listen to her voice rather than the voice of God. And we should take note of this. Anytime we are tempted by someone, something, some ad, some opportunity, which would cause us to compromise our morals, our integrity, our faithfulness, our commitment to God, anytime we're in that situation, there are going to be two voices in play. The voice of the thing or person that's trying to draw us off track, and then the steady, consistent, still small voice of the Lord. And we're going to always have to choose which voice to listen to in those moments. And Abram chose very poorly here. Now, the second thing that goes wrong is that Sarai treats her servant as an object or tool rather than a human being. The language that says she took Hagar and gave her to Abram, again, harkens back to the Garden of Eden and the fall in Genesis 3, where it says that Eve took the fruit and gave it to Adam. So we see that Sarai is treating Hagar like an object to be just taken and moved over here, give it to whoever you want. She's like a piece of fruit. She's like a belonging. She can do with her whatever she pleases. This is considered the fall of Abram. It's a reenactment of the fall from Genesis 3. Now, ancient law and custom did say that a servant was the property of their master or their mistress. And this was actually an allowable custom. This could even be considered a chance for social mobility or increased security for Hagar. Nevertheless, this is outside of God's will, and it should be appalling to us that Sarai treats her this way and that Abram goes along with it. But then Sarai's plan instantly backfires when Hagar gets pregnant, and then she looks down on Sarai, who is barren. Barren women in that time were considered very humble and dishonorable people. It was humiliating to be barren. And this was not an uncommon thing for a servant to get pregnant and then look down on her mistress. There's actually an ancient law code from this time. You can Google this. It's called the Code of Hammurabi. It's from about the 1700s BC. And section 146 of the Code of Hammurabi says what to do when a mistress gives her servant to her husband to get pregnant, and then the servant does and looks down on her mistress. So this was something that Sarai should have been able to foresee. It was very common. And so Sarai has to deal with this issue of Hagar looking down on her. And then Sarai, she blames Abram for the whole thing. And to be honest, Abram is to blame. He is to blame for his passivity and his participation in this scheme. It is repulsive. But Sarai is also to blame for doubting God and pushing him into the situation. But now Abram has a choice to make. Whenever we make a terrible decision, we have a choice when it blows up. Take responsibility for it and own it like a man or a woman of God, or just keep making bad decisions. So at this point, Abram should have called a timeout. And he should have said, listen, Sarai, I'm sorry. I blew it. I'm the one who heard from God. I should not have gone along with this. You were hurting. You were weak. But now we're in this. And Hagar is carrying my child, so we're going to have to make the best of it. But instead of that, what does he do? He says in verse 6, well, she's your servant. Do with her whatever you want. He just passed it over to Sarai, the woman pregnant with his child. And it says that Sarai dealt harshly with her. Now, commentators are quick to point out that this is the same Hebrew word, hana, translated dealt harshly, that will also be used in Exodus chapter 1 to describe how the Egyptians are dealing harshly with the Israelites in captivity, how they were afflicting them and tormenting them and making them miserable. That is what Sarai starts doing to young, pregnant Hagar. And Abram does nothing, completely passive. So we've got abuse and neglect going on here. And so Hagar runs away, and honestly, I'm glad she did. This was not a safe environment. She was a victim here. And then we get to the divine intervention section where things turn around. Then God enters the scenario. Verse 7, the angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. So Hagar is by the spring of water on the way to Shur, which shows that she's heading back toward Egypt. And then she has this encounter with this character, the angel of the Lord. Now, the angel of the Lord is a very special and important character in the Old Testament. You'll notice when the angel of the Lord pops up and speaks, the people consider it as if God himself is speaking with them, as if they're meeting with God. So many people, the very common thought is that the angel of the Lord is actually a manifestation of God in human form to communicate God's will to people. And some people, including myself, believe that when the angel of the Lord shows up, that this is what you call a Christophany, an Old Testament Christ appearance. It's Christ showing up. He's always existed from eternity past. And so maybe this is him, and that's what many believe, and that's my take on it. And strangely enough, the angel of the Lord tells her to return and submit to Sarai, but he also makes these great promises to her. Look at verse 10. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So this is quite astonishing. As a member of Abram's household, now Hagar and her son are going to be grafted in to Abram's promise of having a multitude of descendants, even though they'll be outside of God's covenant people, the people of Israel, which will come through their later son, Isaac. Now, God also gives the first annunciation statement that we see in the Bible. That is a place where the Lord announces the birth of a special child and even gives the name that the child will be called. And he says that the child should be called Ishmael, which means God hears, because God has been hearing the cries of Hagar in her affliction. She was crying out to the Lord, and the Lord heard her cries. And he tells her that this boy is going to be a wild donkey of a man. This would come off differently to her than it does to us. A wild donkey was something that was strong and lived in the wilderness, untamed and undomesticated, but not necessarily a complete fool, as we might think. But God says that Ishmael will be a man that's in continual conflict with others, even his own kin. Now, we have to understand something, that Muslims, who represent one of the other huge Abrahamic religions, they believe that Muhammad, he probably was a descendant of Ishmael. And they believe that Ishmael was the child of promise, not Isaac. And so this is the beginning of what would become the people of Islam in the world. It should be noted that the people of Ishmael and the people of Isaac are still obviously in conflict to this day. This is where it all came from. This is the consequence of Abram and Sarah's disaster. We are living in it. And this conflict between Ishmael's descendants and Isaac's, it's not going to be solved until Jesus comes back. We have Abram and Sarai to thank for what we are experiencing in the world with regard to the Muslim, Jewish, and everything else controversy that keeps going on, or conflict that keeps going on. So Hagar responds in the closing verses. Verse 13, so she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Be'er Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. And this is actually as beautiful as an ending as could possibly come from this train wreck of events. Through this interaction, Hagar comes to know the God who has been looking after her. And she even gives him a new name. It's very beautiful. She calls him the God of seeing, or the God who sees me. It's El Roi. El Roi. El is God, and Roi is sees or sees me. And some people still love to use that name for prayer today. It's a great biblical name for God. El Roi, the God who sees. And she says, here I have seen him who looks after me. Isn't that beautiful? I have seen him who looks after me. She goes back and gives birth, and Abram claims the child as his own. That's what it means when it says that he called the name of his son Ishmael. That's ownership. That's adoption or claiming. Apparently, Hagar shared this divine encounter with Abram, and he believed her. Hopefully, this provided some more security for Hagar and Ishmael as things would continue. So as much as I like Abram and Sarai as biblical examples, a lot of the time, I got more and more sick to my stomach as I studied this text this week. I'm not impressed with their behavior, and I hope you aren't either, but I am impressed with the fact that the Bible doesn't hide the ugly parts of the history of God's people. And God includes these sections in his word, and not only so we'll know how the things that we're experiencing today got started, but also so that there'll be warnings for us. So let me share 3 things we learned from this text and then some closing applications. Number 1, this text shows us so clearly that sin creates complexity. One aspect of sin that we often don't think about, not only is it wrong, not only does it damage our relationship with God and other people, but it also adds stressful complexity to the rest of our lives. Now, judging by the chapters that follow, it seems that God forgives Abram and Sarai, but they're going to have to live with the consequences of this chapter, of these actions, for the rest of their lives. Ishmael will continue to cause stress for the family, and the descendants of Israel are still warring against the people of Israel to this day, trying to wipe them out. So when you're tempted to do something that isn't in line with God's will, think not only about whether it's right or wrong, but think about whether you're going to be willing to live with the aftermath. Because as it says in Numbers 32:23, be sure of this, your sin will find you out. It may seem like a simple thing that you do in the privacy of a bedroom, but friends, you're going to have to deal with the long-term consequences of whatever you sow, and they are guaranteed. Now, number 2, this teaches us that passivity causes more problems. One of the hardest things in life is trying to figure out when to stand up for what's right and when to just let things go. But being passive in order to appease others can cause way more problems than standing up for what's right. Even after Abram had stood up for Lot and rescued the people of the Jordan Valley, showing great bravery, here we see him capitulating to a terrible scheme of his wife to appease her and creating so many more problems. So men and women of God, being spiritually or morally passive in our homes or workplaces, just know that long-term, it's a terrible idea. Standing up for what is right when you're getting pressure is never pleasant. It's never comfortable. It's often scary and painful. But being passive when you should stand up, that's going to only make things worse for you and those who trust you down the road. Men of God, we need to be active in our leadership in our families. You know, too often it's the men who become passive and the women become the leaders, dragging the men along. This should not be the case. We're grateful when both men and women lead together in the home. That's what it should be. And then when one of us gets off, the other doesn't appease in a way that compromises the integrity of the family, then the other one gently corrects. That's why we have one another. So the third thing we see is that this shows us that God has higher expectations. I'm sure you've noticed that the expectations that God has for people, as detailed in his word, are very different than those of the outside world that we live in. What we need to know about this chapter is that other than Hagar looking with contempt on Sarai after she got pregnant, everything else that happens here was completely socially acceptable at the time. Everything that happens here. But the reason that God called Abram out of the pagan, immoral culture around him and began showing his power through Abram so that people would see that God is different than the world. And through how he would interact with Abram and Abram's descendants, people would see the holiness of God and what God is calling us to step into, his higher expectations for the human race. In our world, we need to remember that just because everyone in our school is doing something, that does not make it right. Just because everything in our workplace, everyone in our workplace or our company is doing something, that doesn't make it right. Just because the people on TV shows are living a certain lifestyle, that doesn't make it right. Just because this pop singer or this rapper or whatever is singing about something, some lifestyle, that doesn't make it right. This is why Paul would say in Romans 2, do not be conformed to this world. Step out of that and be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That by testing everything by God's word, you may be able to discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So now let me tie it up with some closing applications. Number one, from this text, we learn that when we have to wait, we need to stick with God's plan. You know, so much of our lives is made up of waiting for things to get better at work or at home, waiting for a time when things are easier, waiting for the spouse we've been praying for to walk into our lives, waiting for test results to come in. This entire sequence of events in this passage happened because Sarai got tired of waiting for God to keep his promise of a child. So she went rogue. She decided to try to do God's job by going outside of God's playbook. And I guarantee you that she instantly wished that she had just stuck with God's plan and trusted him. I'm sure that she would have rather been barren and have no children and seen the whole plan of many descendants flop than having to deal with her mistress having this healthy child and her feeling terrible about herself. We're all going to go through seasons of waiting in life. It is part of life. In those seasons, the temptation will be to try to go out on our own to get things our own way rather than waiting on God's timing. But friends, waiting is when we grow. Waiting is when our roots grow deeper into God's word. Waiting is when our character develops and we learn impulse control. Waiting is what gives God the time to make us into the kind of people who are ready to receive the great blessings that he has for us. As it says in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31, they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up on wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Good things come, the best things come to those who wait on the Lord. So friend, if you're in a season of waiting right now, stick with God's playbook. Stick with his plan. Don't go outside of his will to try to get what he has promised. He is the one who will satisfy your desires with good things so that your youth and vitality are renewed like the eagles. To go outside of God's plan to fulfill our desires will only result in complexity and pain. Number two, we can apply the principle from this text that is, when we make a wrong turn, we need to turn around quickly. When you make a wrong turn, don't keep going in the wrong direction. And this reminded me of an episode from my junior year of college. My roommate Vickus and I were driving from our college apartment in DeKalb, Illinois, to Libertyville, Illinois. It was 82 miles straight east and a little north. We were going to a concert there, and we were going to stay at our friend Mike's house. And so we went to the concert. The next day, we got up, and we're driving back to school. But this was before, like, MapQuest even. I mean, before, you guys can't even imagine that, some of you, before MapQuest, okay? Before Google Maps, before GPS. So Mike gave us directions. Somehow, on the square, I think, we just took the wrong turn. We got off at the wrong place and just started driving. Now, at this time, we could never get over how absolutely hilarious we were. And so we would often make songs up. We were both music majors. We thought we were just the funniest people. So we were just entertaining ourselves, making up songs, singing. And then after a couple hours, we looked around. We're like, where are we? I mean, we should have been back at DeKalb like 40 minutes ago and we're in the middle of nowhere. So we pulled into a farmhouse and said, where are we? And they say, you're in Wisconsin. We had been driving straight north for 2 hours. We had to turn around, and it took us almost all day to get back to school. The quicker you turn around when you get off track, the better things are going to be. When Abram passively gave in to Sarai's demand for him to impregnate Hagar, he took a wrong turn. But when Sarai got mad and blamed him for it, he kept going in the wrong direction when he told her to treat Hagar however she wanted. And we see this every day. People make bad decisions in life, and rather than turning around, they keep going in the wrong direction. And they grow deeper and deeper into denial, deeper and deeper into trying to justify their first decision by doing more of the same thing. Try to say, no, it's okay. It's okay to do this. Or deeper into dishonesty. When you make a wrong turn in life, turn around. Eat a big slice of humble pie. Pull out the map and get back on track. The sooner, the better, but any time is better than never. The longer you wait, the harder it will be, but there is always grace for people who turn around. There's always grace for people who turn around, and God will forgive you, and he'll help you live in the complexity that you may have created. It says in Proverbs 28:13, whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but whoever forsakes and confesses them will obtain mercy. You know, maybe you have made a wrong turn in your life. Maybe you're the only one that knows about it. And you're kind of in this quagmire. Do I keep going? Do I come up with a logical explanation for why it's okay for me to have done this or keep doing this? Or do I turn around and face the music? Grab a slice of humble pie and just begin sorting out the different complexities that I may have created. There's always grace for people who turn around. It is dangerous to keep going in the wrong direction. And if that's you, I pray that you'll turn around. Turn back today. God is waiting to restore and strengthen you and help you deal with whatever situation you might have found yourself in. Now, the final application is this. When you're hurting, God sees and cares. My favorite line in this whole chapter is verse 13, where Hagar, the victim, says, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Maybe you feel like you're in the place of deepest pain and confusion today. Maybe you thought you could count on other people, but that has proven not to be the case, and it hurts. Maybe you thought you'd be at a different point, a different place at this time in your life, but here you are, and you don't feel good about yourself. Maybe you thought you would be more resilient by now, but you're still hurting. You're still feeling weaker, and you're embarrassed. And what God is saying to you today is that he is Elroy. He is the God who sees. He is the God who sees and looks after you. And you don't have to be strong on your own because he has plenty of strength for you. He wants you to know that this season will not go on forever. The pain won't be everlasting, that he is with you and he knows how to guide you through. Friends, our God is a God who sees. Our God is a God who cares. Our God is a God who has given his word so that we can make the best possible decisions in the most difficult situation. And he's the God who continually gives grace to those who turn around and run back into his arms. So wherever you find yourself today, know that he is waiting and he will walk with you and he will stick with you to make the best possible scenario out of whatever your life looks like. Let's pray.